Welcome to episode 94 of Live with a Maverick. My name is Dominic Lee, founder of Maverick Actuary. We are a content community. Our mission is to maximize the impact and value of quant professionals on a global scale. The goal of this series is to educate our community on the most relevant themes in actuarial science, risk management, and analytics. The theme of today's discussion is media psychology, and we are very excited to have with us our guest for today's episode, Dorothy Andrews. Dorothy is a senior behavioral data scientist and actuary at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, NAIC. Welcome, Dorothy.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm great. And second, just to mention also, second guest from the NAIC, we had 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗏 on last year. So, and that was great.
Awesome.
And I know this will be good as well. So yeah, just love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Very happy to have you on. I know we've been talking about this for some time.
Sure.
So very excited. But yeah, let's love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Yeah, so like you said, I'm Dorothy Andrews. I work for the NAIC. I work on the rate model review team where we review filings for the states to help them make approval decisions. We try to educate the states on some of the technical aspects of filings so that, should they ever have to go back and do something themselves or read through the report, they have a really good understanding of, what it is they're approving and what, if any, next steps they need to take before approval. I spend a lot of time talking about bias. It's one of my passions because when insurers started using like algorithms and big data to try to figure out what kind of customer someone's going to be, I thought it was really important that there be some psychology involved. And I wasn't seeing a lot of psychology. So one of the things I thought was important for me to do anyway was to study media psychology. And when I happened on the path of media psychology, I really just fell in love with the idea that you can use media to really understand people, but you have to do it responsibly. And doing it responsibly means using principles of human psychology, not just applying analytics to a bunch of data. You really need to understand kind of the consequences of what you're doing.
Excellent. Now, what I find interesting is when I think of the NAIC, the first thing that comes to my mind is more regulation, to be honest. I think that's how many of us or most of us think of the NAIC and kind of their purview. And honestly, I don't think of the words or the terms regulation and media in the same sentence, at least when it comes to the insurance and risk management space, of course,
right,
in the broader space, perhaps. So I'm just curious to know, like with this particular role that you have, the senior behavioral data scientist, was that role made for you, or is the role that has existed previously that you kind of stepped into?
No, it was really made for me, I would say. I wrote the job description. And so I think the regulators did recognize that I do understand these bias concepts pretty well and can identify when a model is using data that might be prejudicial in some negative kind of way or adverse kind of way toward consumers. And so that's what I was really wanting to understand. It's not like just saying, oh, you have race and, you can discriminate against race. Well, some of the variables are really not that obvious. You have to really think about what are some of these social systemic reasons why a particular variable would behave in some kind of adverse way in a model toward a consumer. So I like the example of crime data, traffic citation data in particular, because this data is really dependent upon human behavior. Some police officer decides, oh, I'm going to go stop this person for speeding. They get to the window and whatever goes on between their ears, influences the next things that they're going to say. And so, the officer may decide to write a ticket. The officer may not decide to write a ticket. But what kinds of factors influence that officer writing the ticket? Are there any internal biases that officer may have, he decides to let some people go, and other ones he decides to give a ticket. And so the question is that human behavior a driving factor in people in communities of color getting more tickets than people in white communities? And it's those types of things that I look for and try to understand before I say a data element, might be biased. So, and that really does take understanding concepts like correlation versus causation, proxy discrimination. I mean, it's not just as black and white as most people approach the subject. You really have to think, from a social science perspective, how did the data actually get that way? And what I like to tell people all the time, that bias really is the result of human behavior. It doesn't get into data by itself. So you really need to understand the human behaviors that might impact that data. Now you have some people, and I think actuaries are probably guilty of this, they think the analysis starts and stops with a number. And I really would like to see actuaries move away from that type of behavior and take on more of a social science role, because actuaries are supposed to be social scientists anyway. They have the analytical skills, and I think we just need to have them adopt more of these social science type skills to combine with the analytics when they're doing analysis. Because it's really those behavioral types of reasons that that people are looking for. They're not always looking for just the number, because the number doesn't tell the whole story.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, and that's some very helpful context. Now let's take a step back. I mentioned that the theme of today's discussion is media psychology, and I know you provided a very helpful illustration there where you talked about traffic citations, and you used an interesting reference where you talked about what's going on in between someone's errors in terms of how they assess a situation. So I think you might have partially answered this question already, but if we take a step back, there's very 30,000-foot view, like how would you describe the term media psychology?
So when we think of media, most people think of like radio, TV, print, music, right? But media is really any type of medium that is between you and someone you interact with and how you interact with your environment. Now, this media can actually influence how you interact with your environment. And, we see things like this all the time. Like, you probably have tried to buy something, for example. And, if you go on Amazon and you're looking to buy something, one of the first things you see when you go to look at that item is say, well, there are only 2 left, And so that's like the scarcity principle of persuasion. And you really don't want the medium influencing what you see. Another example is Google searches. Now, a lot of people think Google searches are based on, like citation importance, but it really isn't. It's based on who pays to get their ads, floated to the top of the pile. And that actually influences your decision making. So that can have a real impact on how you make a decision. And it's those type of soft cues that we see in the media that are influencing people that I don't think people have a lot of a great deal of understanding with. And even buying insurance, if you're buying insurance off a website, there might be all kinds of cues, on the website that are influencing how you make that decision. And so all of these types of media really impact how you transact with your environment. And it's understanding, did they put a cue there, for example? If you look at movies, for example, sometimes you'll see like brand products sitting, like, let's say a can of Coke sitting in a very specific place in the scene. And no one ever really thinks about it, but a lot of thought went into putting that can of Coke in that particular position in the scene so it could be filmed. And that's really planting a seed to say, oh, maybe I should buy me some Coke. You know what I mean? Coca-Cola, that is.
Yeah.
But it's all those subtle types of ways that, you know, we can influence someone's perception about the world and hence influence their decision making. And so it's those types of things that I'm really concerned about as well.
What's interesting there is I could think of two examples off the top of my head that corroborate what you just said. The first one is probably around 10 years ago, unfortunately, I got scammed. So I had something was wrong with my laptop, and I went online, of course, to find customer service. I think it was might have been a Sony laptop. And the banner ad that was at the top, it ended up being the company who, and there was since a class action lawsuit, they were shut down, but their ad was at the top. And I think that's the reason I felt comfortable clicking on it because of where it was situated. And of course, it was you know, falsely stated to be Sony. That's one example. The second one is when you talk about marketing, is I learned this in my first rotation of my first company. Is one of the data scientists there told me it's very common for companies when they're advertising a product, a retailer, mostly retail. You know, there's two ways of advertising it. One is saying, okay, I'm going to advertise the higher price of the discount versus the lower price. So for instance, I may say this product is $100, but there's we're offering a 20% discount, or they may say it's 80. And what they find is that in many cases, the first situation is more appealing to consumers because they have the sense that they're getting a deal.
Yeah. It's like the $9.99 price, right? You'll pay $9.99, but you won't pay $10. It's just it's all in the marketing.
Oh, that's where that came from. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, you know, so
yeah. So I know in terms of your background, I know you're passionate about research. You've done, of course, not just a bachelor's, but you have your PhD, but you've done master's before your PhD in I think it was in mathematical statistics. But what you know, given that you had many paths that you could pursue from a research perspective, what inspired you or what motivated you to do a PhD in media psychology?
Well, really, it really was looking at how insurance, especially in particular underwriting, has gone from being a science of trying to understand who people are, which is basically the information on that insurance application, to how people behave. And not really talking to the person about how they behave, but actually looking at all this data about the person and then trying to paint a picture of the person. You know, these data sets are often woefully incomplete. You know, that's often out of sync with, you know, the time period of your model. And when it is third-party data, you often can't even determine, you know, its veracity. You know, can you actually understand how the third party put that data set together? It's often proprietary, and you know they don't want to share that information, and because it's when they say like data is gold, you know, it really is a gold mine for a lot of companies. And so companies are willing to pay for it because they think they're going to gain some predictive insights. But it's all about how that data set was put together. And, you know, those are the kinds of things that really concern me.
Yeah. No, you know, I mentioned that this podcast is and the community is about quantitative professionals. So, you know, why is media psychology relevant for quantitative professionals? I know earlier you talked a bit about, well, even just recently, you talked a bit about modeling and that media is data and algorithms. So I imagine that's a piece of it, but, you know, do you care to elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, it really goes right back to the idea that we are trying to use data to paint a picture of who someone is. I mean, if, for example, let's say a data is skewed towards, you know, having very few women and who are successful and versus men who are more successful. Well, you know, if you feed that to an algorithm, and this is what happened with like the Amazon hiring algorithm, you know, they also used their own resumes, which was a real problem. And it reflected their historical hiring patterns. But what was so interesting about that particular algorithm that I learned is that women tend to use more nurturing words on their resumes than men. You know, men use like highly technical words. They use words like captured and led. Women use words like assisted, you know, aided. And that algorithm was able to pick out those nuances in language in the resumes to say, okay, these are the resumes that use these types of words that Amazon hasn't hired in the past. So this algorithm is not going to hire them either. And whereas this other pile, oh yeah, these are the resumes that Amazon has hired in the past. And look at the kinds of words they're using. They're very two distinct subsets. And what that really shows is how women are conditioned by society. You know, we are raised to be more nurturing, you know, whereas men are raised to be like the hunters, let's say. Women are more the gatherers. But in that type of you know, upbringing, that type of socialization comes through in the way we speak, the way we behave. And if you aren't aware of those things, then you might not see how an algorithm might pick up on those social differences and then create an environment or an algorithm that discriminates against people. So it's really not just about R coding or Python coding or, you know, numbers. It's really about, let's try to understand, you know, what are the social influences on this data? How did this data get to be the way that it is? And people often talk about these data generating processes. And, you know, I don't see a lot of focus on that, but as much when I look at some of the models I look at. But if you talk to people outside of, you know, actuarial insurance type work, you do. Like I was on a webinar this morning and there was someone from the Center of Democracy and Technology in DC talking about these very same types of issues, that it doesn't start or end with the data. It starts with trying to understand the machine that generated that data. Because if you can understand that process, then maybe you can go back and fix the process that generated the data so that you get a data set that is less biased, or work on the back end to try to make sure that the outcomes don't harm people as much as they otherwise could.
Great. So given the focus that you mentioned, importance of focusing on the social science view of the world and understanding human behavior, regarding quantitative professionals, how is media psychology and the concept of media psychology being vocalized? So you're working at the NAIC, you know, are you in touch with actuaries and data scientists in private practice? What forums are you using, if any, to educate them? Like, how is this happening?
Yeah, so, well, I don't know if you know, but I chair the Data Science and Analytics Committee for the American Academy of Actuaries.
Okay.
And so we lead, I think we develop a lot of technical papers. I think I was first on the big data and the role of the actuary task force, and we wrote a paper, and we started kind of cementing some of those ideas, or laying the foundation for those ideas with that paper. And you can find that paper you know, on the internet. But then when I became the chair of the Data Science and Analytics Committee, I really wanted to have our committee focus on developing like a technical series of papers that would focus on some of these subjects of bias and data and how to think about data and some of the issues with just putting data in a machine and getting an answer out and applying the answer. It's really about more than that. And then working for the NAIC, I also had the pleasure to work with Commissioner Brain on, you know, H committee, which is the Innovation and Technology Committee. And so one of the first things I did with her was help put on, you know, a 2-day bias forum, you know, a fly-in for regulators, where we had all kinds of topics related to bias, identifying bias in data, testing for it. And, you know, and I gave a lot of these kinds of examples where poor training data that was not representative led to biased outcomes, and how modeling teams that are not diverse also contributes to not to having biased outcomes. So, those two factors, I think groupthink is dangerous. I think people, if you're on a modeling team, you're in an environment, you're not allowed to speak up. That's pretty dangerous. Everyone should have like a very strong voice and be able to respectfully voice their opinions, because it's only through that kind of diversity of thought that you can get to a place where you have done a strong analysis of the data and the model and the outcomes before these things go into production. And as most companies do, take a set it and forget it approach, put it into production, hit go, and they're off to something else, right? And at that point, it's also important to make sure that you are monitoring the human use of the machine. Are they using the machine correctly? Are they interpreting the results correctly? And even more importantly, when they see something goes wrong, are they empowered to say, stop, let's stop the machine, let's figure out what we want to do here, and can I override the decision that the machine makes? And I find a lot of people are not empowered to do that. And I think that's a problem. There has to be, some human that says, well, this machine is given an answer that's counterintuitive, and we're not going to use the answer.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. There's something you mentioned earlier, and I'm excited to get into this particular topic. Before we, eventually we want to talk about some very specific practical examples and implications. But first, to better understand media psychology and its practical implications, it's important to understand a few important linkages. And one of them, you talked about a part of it. So the first one is, how would you describe the link between correlation and causality? This is something that every actuary learns in some exam. On the CIS side, I think they talk about in exam 5, which is the basic pricing or the basic rate making exam. But certainly from my experience, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, but if you're not someone who's deeply entrenched in data science, I think this is something that can kind of, it's not really deeply cemented in your day to day. So it's always a topic I found interesting. The link between correlation and causality.
So we actually did write a paper on at the Academy, the Data Science and Analytics Committee. We did write a paper on the relationship, and it was entitled "The Actuarial Perspective of Correlation," and you can find that paper too. And so when we think of correlation, we're just thinking about how things are moving together. Like a train could be riding down a track. A plane could be flying across the sky. Those two are certainly moving in the same direction. There's some correlation in, where they're headed. However, did the plane cause the train to move? Did the train cause the plane to move? No. These are just kind of like simple kinds of explanations about, correlation and causation. Now, if you have causation, do you have correlation? Yeah, you can have that. We've actually seen cases where you can have causation and not have causation, correlation. There are certain examples where you can have that too. And so the main thing about causation is that when we have causation, we actually have an explanation of how one behavior influences another. We don't have that with correlation. And so another paper that we're about to publish, the Data Science and Analytics Committee is about to publish, is something on a paper on natural experiments. And so the difference between let me say this. The gold standard for causation has always been like the randomized controlled trial, where you have like a control group, you have a treatment group, you introduce some kind of manipulation, and you see if the manipulation produces different outcomes in the two groups. Then you would say that manipulation is the cause for the difference. However, in those types of studies, they're usually in very controlled environments. You've got scientists that are overseeing it, or researchers overseeing the experiment, like the development for the vaccine for COVID perfect example of where a randomized controlled trial was used. Now, unfortunately, in insurance, you can't always develop a randomized controlled trial if you want to demonstrate causation, right? If you want to just, if you want to say that, oh, well, slippery roads causes accidents, well, you have to set up those conditions, right? And that's really not often ethical to do. You don't want to set up an experiment where people could likely die just to prove causation. Well, there's these other things called natural experiments. And these are experiments that are really not the result of a group of researchers getting together and saying, oh, I have a control group and a treatment group, and I'm going to apply a manipulation. These things just occur naturally in nature. And in fact, a lot of people refer to them as happy accidents. So for example, let's say you have an intersection and you've got cars going back and forth, and there's a high rate of accidents at this intersection. And then all of a sudden the town says, you know, maybe we should put a traffic light there. You know, well, there's the manipulation. There were no scientists around. There was no control or treatment group or anything like that. But then after the traffic light went up, you notice that there was a huge decline in traffic accidents at that intersection. Well, that would be an example of a natural experiment. So natural experiments are great if you can find them. One of the problems is you may not find a natural experiment for every situation for which you want to demonstrate causation. So that's kind of a shortcoming of them. And, you know, there could be, you might have some issues if you like of the frequentist persuasion, you might say, well, you know, the data may not have been controlled for, there could have been other mitigating factors. There's some other considerations to think about, but that's the idea between correlation and causation. You want to be able to say an action in one variable, if I manipulate a variable, I can cause a particular outcome. Whereas you don't have that type of manipulation in a correlation.
I think in some ways that's what makes insurance interesting, but at the same time, it can make this is my personal opinion, it can make it frustrating at times. Because when we think of not being able to demonstrate causation, if you look at the variable like credit, for example, I know there's, again, I'm not trying to impose any views here. There's different views on that. What I was getting at is a rational explanation, and the rational explanation is something that's used within the industry, or that's industry standard, I think, to explain the relationship between an individual variable and the target.
Yeah.
No, but it's not bulletproof. It's not a smoky mirror. There's a lot of subjectivity and sometimes I think ambiguity around that. So on one hand, it can make, I think, insurance interesting when you think of it from a regulatory perspective, but there's also the potential social impact, which I want to get into a bit further down the conversation. So this is some observation I have, like when we think of correlation and causality.
Well, you know, the NAIC produced a white paper on predictive modeling where they talked about rational explanations and how these should be like kind of intuitive explanations that shows how two things may be related, and that they don't have to demonstrate causation, but there should be some kind of common sense way that a layperson would understand why a particular variable might be important in causing a change in another variable. And, you know, we see this all the time. Companies providing rational explanations that are not really all that rational sometimes. And then there are times when there are companies that provide really, really good rational explanations, and there's just no question of what they're doing. So, you know, is there a gold standard for coming up with a rational explanation? No, not really. But you know a good one when you see one, is kind of the way it works.
Yeah. Another linkage I want to talk about, or another link, is the link between cognitive bias and cognitive dissonance. So there's a LinkedIn post that you did, and I'm just going to paraphrase what you said. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I think you talked about, I think you were commenting on a post on LinkedIn, and you said that cognitive dissonance is necessary to, I think, to balance the impact of cognitive bias, or to be a counterbalance.
I said cognitive biases. They're important in preventing or managing cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance, simply stated, is really kind of is when there's a disconnect between your expectation and reality. And that causes you to feel some type of consternation about your situation. Like, let's say you bought something and you had high expectations for this good or service. And then when you got it, you were like, oh, this didn't work the way it was supposed to work. I'm not that happy. I didn't get the right haircut, or, whatever it is. And so you went through a moment of cognitive dissonance there, where your reality didn't match your expectations. And you had to figure out some way of trying to deal with that. So, a lot of people would say, oh, if it's a haircut, if the person gives you a refund, you kind of feel a little bit better about the situation. Or if you bought something you didn't like and you return it, then you kind of feel a little bit, at least you reduced your cognitive dissonance through those actions. Cognitive biases, these are really mechanisms that help us deal with our reality as well. And so, I like to talk about, things that, for example, when you have to deal with too much information, you tend to generalize as opposed to try to keep track of every little specific detail. That would be an example of a situation where a cognitive bias would come into play. People do this with confirmation bias, for example. It allows you to reconcile, what with what your reality is. And you may not be right, but at least you feel better. You're like, oh yeah, I like this guy because he agrees with everything that I say. For example, that may not necessarily be a good thing for somebody else, but it might be a good thing for you. So, and that's really kind of the selfish point about it. And the thing about bias, and what was so good about this meeting, this webinar today with this woman from the Center of Democracy and Technology, was she said something that I'm constantly saying, that not all bias is bad. Lots of biases are very helpful to us, and in insurance, we have gotten to the point of thinking that bias is bad. And it's all bad. I mean, in fact, you not just people in insurance, but you see other professionals treating bias as if it's a bad thing, like universally. And we have fairness metrics that have been developed just to kind of detect this bad thing in data. So it's a really deep subject, and I often talk to people about this thing called the Cognitive Bias Codex, which it catalogs like over 180 cognitive biases known to date. And it's not all bad. I mean, when we think of like a bias that's bad, we have to think of what is the impact to somebody else? Is it causing a harmful impact to someone? Then maybe it is bad. But, the fact that I like, peanut butter pecan ice cream, over, coffee ice cream, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I didn't really hurt anybody by having that, that bias. I might have hurt the person who's selling coffee ice cream, but, you kind of get the idea that bias is not all bad. But when we get to the point where, it is actually impacting lives in an adverse way, which is what some of these large-scale algorithms can do, because they can act so quickly and in such a massive way that, they can often have an impact that if you don't stop them and if you're not paying attention, people can get hurt.
Great. Now, how do these terms, we spent some time talking about, the link between correlation and causality, and then the link between cognitive bias and cognitive dissonance, and we spoke about those terms individually. Now, how do these terms help us to make sense of media psychology?
Well, again, it's all about, so let me put it this way. If we didn't have an algorithm, or machines, we could do a lot of the work of the machines. And a lot of that work is done by human intellect. Now, person A dealing with person B also can have some bias, right? You agree with that, right?
Yeah.
You don't need a machine to be biased. What's happening when you introduce the machine, and there's an author, Benjamin Ruha, she talks about the new Jim code, not crow, but code.
Yeah.
Referring to how these algorithms are really digitizing, discrimination. I mean, and really what you also see is that as humans, we tend to trust machines more than we do our own intuition, which is really kind of not a really good thing, because the machine is, again, programmed by the human. So it's kind of counterintuitive that sometimes we trust what's coming out of the machine more than what's coming out of the human. And that really is the psychology. So the fact that we put this machine between person A and person B, that is the medium right there. But the psychology is the same. But now we're pushing the psychology through the machine. And those are the things that we need to be paying close attention to. Because if the machine, doesn't have sentience, if the machine sort of makes decisions and we just blindly trust what's coming out of the machine, I think that's a problem, which is why, I really have an issue with things with these large language models like ChatGPT. Because, first of all, they can really be fooled into doing all kinds of stupid things. And you don't even have to fool them. They can do stupid things all by themselves. But as we see younger generations advance in this and they grow up with this technology, I mean, they were born digital. And I was born analog, just so you know. But, being born digital and relying so much on the technology, you just hope that they can actually catch when some of these manipulations are occurring. And that's the thing that really causes me great concern, that, younger generations are, going to be so reliant on this technology. They may not even see the harm coming before it's too late.
Thanks for mentioning large language models. We actually, for anyone interested in exploring that further, we have an episode 43, Predictive Analytics, where we talk about some of the pitfalls there. So if you want to get more details on large language models, check out that particular episode. So, Dorothy, know that we have a sound understanding of media psychology and its relevance for quantitative professionals. Let's explore the practical side in more details. I know earlier in the conversation, you mentioned a very relevant example. I think you talked about speeding tickets.
Right.
Any other examples that you can talk about in terms? So two things I'm trying to get at here. Actually, I want to just discuss a few very practical examples, but more importantly, what are the potential downstream implications on society? So I guess the two-parter is, what are some of the examples, and then what's the potential impact?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I sometimes talk about is like this green light technology. The technology, it's based on basically one part of the light spectrum that doesn't read darker skin as well as it reads lighter skin. And that's really all about how the training data was put together to design that technology. They didn't have a lot of people of darker skin in the training data, and therefore the model itself, it failed when it was used in practice. And I mean, when you look at the issues that people have with the pulse oximeters, for example, that also had some real issues with regard to measuring blood oxygen levels, which, really contributed in part to why people died. And so, especially Black people. And so you have now people, I read the other day that someone thinks they've cracked this issue with green light technology and the pulse oximeter, and they think they've built a better mousetrap. But again, it's, different technologies. How are you actually training the data? And, are you testing, how well is it tested against people who are different before it actually goes into production and now you see it sitting on the shelf? There's another doctor, he's still in medical school, but on the internet, he's known as like the medical myth buster. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. But anyway, he talks about a lot of failings in medicine that are based off of a lot of stereotypes about people of color, and how those different stereotypes have influenced medical technology, like kidney functions. It used to be that there was like a race correction factor in some of these tests, and it didn't have anything to do with anything biological. It was just people trying to make, race a biological construct, or making it more biologically important than what it was. The famous healthcare example where they used a metric to decide who should be referred to for specialist care. And the metric was based on healthcare spending. Well, so here's the social science, right? If the people on that modeling team, when that algorithm said, well, Black people are just more healthier than white people, that's why the referrals are less. Someone should have said, that doesn't make any sense to me. But then when you looked at the metric that they used, the metric then did make sense, because if certain groups have less access to care, there's going to be less medical spending on them. And so that was the flaw in that metric. But again, you would need like a diverse team thinking through a lot of these social science issues to say, well, that doesn't make any sense, because we know like there are food deserts, right, in Black communities. They don't have like a lot of medical facilities in these communities. What is their choice for healthcare? It's probably the emergency room. I mean, these are all factors, or they have a huge distrust for the medical establishment. All of these things that go on between our ears impact our behavior. So, some people, there have been studies that show that, Black people often defer care longer than they should because of some of this distrust for the medical establishment. But, there's just so many different examples out there. And one thing that I'm really happy to see is I see a lot of people talking about these types of social issues. Not so much actuaries, but I see health professionals, lots of health professionals talking about these issues. And I really think we can learn a lot from the way some of these other professionals are applying social science to understand data, so that we don't keep making some of these same mistakes. I mean, I was on a market conduct exam where this attorney said, the data is the data. I don't think I'll ever forget how she said that until I expire. And it's like, no, the data isn't the data. There is some social science that can help explain how the data got that way.
That's a great example. One more example I want to ask about, because I know a lot of people might be curious being in insurance, is when you think of loss ratio modeling, there's certainly variables, credit, housing. One we spoke about in our pre-meet, I think you mentioned number of relatives. There's some very, lots of different variables, and that could potentially be misconstrued. So any examples there with loss ratio?
Oh, yes. So my dissertation was on the algorithmic link between auto pricing, insurance, and unfair discrimination. And one of the things I wanted to understand was how consumers would respond if they knew of certain variables that were being used to determine their auto insurance premiums. And so I tested like 5 variables. My baseline variable was driving record. I had smoking status, number of criminal relatives, credit score, and criminal background. So almost universally, the participants in that study felt driving history was the most credible factor to determine someone's driving insurance premiums. Number of criminal relatives, and I say that, but there was a company who actually tried to use that variable. The regulator said no, thank God, but they actually tried to use that variable in their model, and with as much passion as with the driving record variable, the participants said no one should be rated on the actions of, a relative. In fact, someone quoted, I can't remember the Bible scripture now. I think it might have been Ezekiel 18:20, chapter 18, verse 2, that says the sins of the father should not impact the son, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. But I mean, people got very biblical about some of these variables. And it was also kind of interesting to see kind of the social justice responses from some of these participants that felt like variables like number of criminal relatives, credit score, criminal background. If it was non-driving related criminal background, they certainly didn't think you should be using that. They felt like those could actually, and even smoking status, they thought those could actually impact marginalized people more than, the majority people. So it was really interesting kind of, reading through some of the thoughts about why people thought certain variables were good variables to use and which ones, they had strong reactions to. And I don't think their reactions were really all that different from reactions we've seen from regulators or other consumer advocate types.
So in terms of you talked about the link between the pricing and the discrimination. I guess if you were to pick out a couple of those variables, what would be you think of the potential downstream implications on society? I guess if some of them were used, I suppose.
Well, some of them are being used, right? Credit scores being used.
Mm-hmm.
We know that, certain communities have less access to credit, so it impacts their credit score. They don't have a lot of large banking centers. It's just social systemic reasons why they might be in the situation that they're in, which really, if you just look through how society treats certain segments versus other, you could really go back to grade school where I was a high school teacher where, these tracking systems, really put kids in certain tracks, right at kindergarten. And it's all about teacher expectations and, certain and how much effort, is expended on certain students versus others. But, once you start to get on these tracks and diverge, it's not that you can't come back, but, you kind of have a path laid out for you. And, then you just deal with other daily assaults, because of, whatever your physical attributes may be. All these things do have an impact on where you actually end up in life. And, during COVID, I thought it was so interesting that we were calling, certain people essential workers when we treat them as anything but essential. They have poor housing, poor health care, poor economics, very few assets. It's just, but I guess, it is interesting that you kind of need an underclass in this country, it seems like, for the whole system to work. Like if everyone had like the same, status, same economics, I just wonder how, our economy would actually work, because it seemed like that came through during COVID.
Interesting. No, there's something that you said when we had the pre-meet, and I'm just going to read it verbatim because I think it really just encapsulates the essence of this conversation. So you mentioned that human behavior determines bias in our data.
Right.
If we can't change behavior, we need to understand how bias impacted data and how you soften the blow. So
That's
as we
right.
think of that, as we think of some of those potential impacts just based on behavior, how like as an industry, when you think of insurance and risk management, how is the
Well,
industry? Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, it's all about that safety net, I mean, you see people are doing studies right now, to say, well, you look at loss ratio, you look at premiums, you look at claims and people who are charged more premiums, do they have higher loss ratios? I mean, it's that type of analysis that's being done. You attach, you know, uh, ethnicity or race data to that type of analysis, and you figure out where these pockets are. And then you have to start asking those hard questions. How did people get into this situation? It's a really, really um, hard problem to try to solve, because on the one hand, you think, well, we're just trying to sell insurance, right? That's what the insurance company would say. We're just trying to sell insurance. And, this is the data we have. It's the best information we have to come up with a price. But I often feel that, sometimes people who end up getting charged the most, there are some truly social systemic reasons why they're in the situations they're in. If you live in a certain zip code and your roads are bad, well, that's going to impact your insurance. But you may work a minimum wage job. You can't live in a 90210 zip code. So when insurance becomes 18% or more of your monthly income, how do you survive? I mean, I don't understand. I really don't understand that. So it just seems to me that there needs to be some kind of safety net. Yeah, sure. The pricing equations say this is how much we should charge.
Yeah.
But not if people can't afford to pay that, do they go without insurance? I mean, there's got to be some kind of solution, because just charging poor people more and more for insurance is just not the solution. That's not going to really solve the problem. You've got to change circumstances, create new infrastructure. And there really needs to be that kind of safety net. I mean, they're even thinking about how to change some of the way that they even come up with credit scores, like some of the variables that they use to determine a credit score, to be more friendly to people, to more marginalized people who don't have some of the credit that other communities have. So, do you count light bills? Do you count phone bills? What do you count in this equation called credit that could be friendlier to people, in certain situations?
Yeah, last point I'll make on that. It's interesting you talk about the social science behind it. I think there's just like also a process and way of business dynamic to it. Because when you think, and this is not an insurance example, but when you think of how people rent homes and when they do credit checks, what I've always found, because I've always rented and I've lived in so many different states, is so I've moved several times, is they've never actually that only happened once. There was only one time where the person, I think they asked for it was just because I live in a very not politically conservative, but I live in a condo building, which I think they're a bit more conservative. So you were just kind of double checking like rental history, but they've never like typically for a standard credit application, they check credit scores, but they never checked, oh, does this person pay their bills? You could easily just ask the landlord or the prior landlord, and they never asked that. So I always thought that was interesting, is that they're just kind of on this machine of using this one variable that they've always used, but
Yeah.
that one might actually be more intelligent. Like, has he actually done it versus will he potentially do it? you know?
Yeah, and when you think about it, when you have a credit event, it usually takes like 3 months for it to hit your credit report, right? It's just it's not instantaneous. There's some lag there. So by any stretch, it's probably not a perfect system. Plus, you can have incorrect data on your credit. I mean, a lot of people say, yeah, but credit scores has been very profitable for the insurance industry. Yeah, that probably is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what I was thinking, is that I mean, I'm just guessing here, is that might be a part of the challenge in addressing some of these issues, is that if these are for-profit companies, and I know that ESG is becoming more of a thing nowadays, but I mean, ultimately, if a company is profit driven, then, and if they're able to use a variable that
Yeah.
may be discriminatory, but it still is accruing to the bottom line, then,
Yeah,
or
it
accretive
seems
to the
like
bottom line.
ESG talk is dwindling to me too, but
Yeah.
you know, it's,
Well, yeah, Dorothy, this was wonderful conversation. Did not
yeah,
disappoint. You
thank
know,
you.
it was well worth the wait. So I'm looking forward to sharing it with the community.
Yeah,
And
sorry it took so long for me to get to the table.
no, it was no
It's been
problem.
quite a
It was
journey to get
well
here,
worth the
but
wait. Well worth the
yeah,
wait.
yeah. Thank you so much. It was
All
a
right.
great conversation.
Great conversation. Well, enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right, you too.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.